You think the Islamic Caliphates were enlightened empires of learning and culture, where slaves were treated with some semblance of mercy because of religious teachings on compassion? Think again. Tomorrow you'd wake up in a Baghdad market, stripped naked, your body inspected like livestock by merchants who decide your fate based on your teeth, muscles, and private parts. The Caliphates didn't just own slaves, they engineered horrors that make modern human trafficking look like a petty crime. From the 7th century to the 19th, the Arab slave trade consumed over 17 million Africans alone, dwarfing the Atlantic trade in scale and savagery. But what you're about to hear isn't the sanitized version from history books. It's the raw, unfiltered truth about acts so depraved they'd make your stomach turn and question everything you know about Islamic golden ages. We're diving into 10 levels of Caliphate slave horror, each more disturbing than the last. First, the nightmare of mass castration, where boys were turned into eunuchs through procedures that killed 90% of them. Then the forced concubinage, where women were bred like animals in harems. We'll expose the death marches across the Sahara that left trails of bones. You'll discover the ritual humiliations in slave markets where humans were displayed like merchandise. We'll reveal the deadly labour in salt mines that dissolved bodies alive. You'll learn about the child soldier conversions where kidnapped boys were brainwashed into fanatical warriors. And finally, the ultimate atrocity, the systematic erasure of identities through forced conversions and name stripping. Each revelation will make you more grateful for modern human rights than ever before. Let's start with the most gruesome entry point, the castration factories that supplied the Caliphate's palaces with perfect servants. Picture this, it's 850 AD in the bustling city of Basra under the Abbasid Caliphate. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, captured from the Slavic lands or sub-Saharan Africa, is dragged into a dimly lit room that reeks of blood and burning herbs. He's not here for mercy, he's here to be transformed into a eunuch, a guardian of the bed for the elite harems. The surgeons, often Jewish or Christian doctors hired for their supposed expertise, tie him down to a wooden table. No anesthesia, just a swig of opium-laced wine if he's lucky. They slice open his scrotum with a razor-sharp blade, remove his testicles in one swift motion, and then, here's the part that will haunt you, they insert a metal plug into his urethra to prevent it from closing while it heals. But healing, that's a joke. The boy is buried up to his neck in hot sand for days, force-fed milk and honey to induce diarrhea, which they believed cleaned the wound. Infection sets in almost immediately. Fever racks his body. Pus leaks from the mangled flesh. If he survives the first week, and most don't, he's left impotent. His voice high-pitched forever. His body a twisted shell designed solely to serve without the threat of sexual desire. Court records from the time boast about these procedures, with one Abbasid caliph proudly owning over 4,000 eunuchs in his palace alone. But here's the disturbing truth most history classes skip. The mortality rate was 90%. For every eunuch who stumbled out alive, 9 boys died in agony, their bodies dumped in mass graves outside the city. Imagine the screams echoing through those factories. Yes, they were factories, with assembly line efficiency in places like Verdun, in France, or Zanzibar, where thousands of boys were processed annually to feed the Caliphate's demand. But wait, it gets worse. These weren't random acts of cruelty, they were systematic, economically driven horrors. The Caliphates needed eunuchs because Islamic law forbade free Muslim men from guarding harems. Too much temptation, so they imported non-Muslims, castrated them en masse, and sold the survivors at premium prices. A healthy eunuch could fetch 1,000 dinars, equivalent to a fortune today, while an intact slave went for a fraction. Merchants in Baghdad's slave markets would advertise freshly prepared eunuchs like they were selling spiced dates. And the methods evolved in brutality. In the early Umayyad period, they used crude crushing techniques, tying cords around the genitals until they necrosed and fell off. By the Fatimid era in Egypt, surgeons refined it with cauterization, burning the wound with hot irons to stop bleeding, which often led to gangrene. One surviving account from a 10th century traveller, Ibn Hawkal, describes piles of discarded genitals rotting in the sun outside castration centres. The psychological torture was as bad as the physical. Boys who survived were indoctrinated to believe their mutilation was a blessing, making them closer to God by removing earthly desires. Some were even forced to castrate others later in life, perpetuating the cycle. Here's what most people don't realise: this wasn't just about harems. Eunuchs rose to power as administrators, generals and viziers because their lack of heirs made them loyal without dynastic ambitions. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt was literally ruled by former slave eunuchs who had endured this hell. But at what cost? Archaeological digs in Sudan and Ethiopia reveal mass graves of young male skeletons with telltale pelvic damage, silent testimony to the scale of this atrocity. The demand drove raids deep into Europe and Africa. Viking traders sold Slavic boys to Muslim merchants in Constantinople, who shipped them to Baghdad for castration. African kingdoms like Kanem-Bornu supplied Zanj slaves by the thousands, marching them across the Sahara where many were prepared mid-journey. If a boy resisted, they'd do partial castrations first, removing just one testicle as punishment, before finishing the job. Women weren't spared variations. Some female slaves underwent infibulation, sewing their genitals to ensure purity, though that was more common in later Ottoman times. The religious justification twisted Islamic teachings. While the Quran urges kind treatment of slaves and manumission as a pious act, scholars like al-Mawadi rationalized castration as necessary for social order, claiming it prevented fitna, thus chaos, in the household. But in practice it was profit over piety. Caliphs like Harun al-Rashid, romanticized in 1001 Nights, owned harems guarded by these mutilated men, their opulent courts built on this blood. Modern estimates suggest over 1 million boys were castrated across the Caliphate's history, with survival rates improving only slightly to 20% by the 12th century, thanks to better antiseptics like vinegar and salt. Yet the horror persisted. In Zanzibar under Omani rule, a successor to the Caliphates, British explorers in the 1800s witnessed eunuch factories still operating, with boys chained together awaiting the knife. Imagine if this happened today. International courts would call it genocide, a crime against humanity. But back then it was business as usual, documented in ledgers like any commodity. The social consequences rippled outward. Families in raided villages mourned sons who vanished, only to hear rumours of their fate. Survivors, if freed, often committed suicide, unable to live with the shame and physical ruin. One eunuch, the famous Abu al-Misk Kafur, rose to rule Egypt in the 10th century, but his biographies hint at deep trauma, his rule marked by paranoia and cruelty, perhaps a reflection of his own suffering. This makes modern discussions of human rights seem like a hard-won miracle. Today we have the Geneva Conventions, anti-trafficking laws, and medical ethics that would make such acts unthinkable. No more metal plugs in urethras, no more burying boys in sand to heal. We've forgotten how normalized this was, how empires glorified as beacons of civilization hid such darkness. But here's the truly disturbing part. At least castration was for a purpose in their twisted logic. What if I told you the next horror involved women treated as breeding stock, their bodies commodified in ways that would make Handmaid's Tale look tame? What if I told you the next horror involved women treated as breeding stock, their bodies commodified in ways that would make The Handmaid's Tale look tame? Welcome to the second level of Caliphate slave atrocity, the forced concubinage system where captured women were imprisoned in vast harems, not for romance or luxury, but for systematic breeding to produce more slaves or heirs for the elite. Forget the exotic tales of silk cushions and perfumed gardens. These were human farms disguised as palaces, where women's wombs were weapons of empire building, and resistance meant torture or death. In the opulent courts of the Umayyads, Abbasids, and later the Ottomans, who inherited and expanded caliphate traditions, harems housed thousands of slave women, known as jawari or concubines, selected for their beauty, fertility, and exotic origins. A single caliph like al-Mutawakkil in the 9th century boasted over 4,000 concubines, each one a prisoner whose primary duty was to bear children on demand. These women weren't wives with rights, they were property, bought at markets or captured in raids from as far as Ireland, India, and Ethiopia. The process began with brutal selection. Upon arrival, they'd be stripped, bathed, and examined by eunuch overseers, those same mutilated men from our first horror, who probed their bodies for defects, virginity, and childbearing potential. If deemed suitable, they were fattened up like livestock on rich diets of dates, milk, and honey to enhance curves and fertility, all while being taught submissive arts, dancing, poetry, and sexual techniques to please their master. But here's where it turns truly nightmarish. Conception wasn't left to chance, it was engineered. Caliphs and wealthy emirs employed physicians to monitor menstrual cycles, using primitive calendars and herbal concoctions to induce ovulation. Women were summoned to the bedchamber based on these calculations, forced into intimacy whether they wanted it or not. Refusal? That meant the whip, or worse, being sold to a lower status owner or executed for disobedience. Once pregnant, they were isolated in special quarters, their diets controlled to ensure healthy offspring. Male children born to concubines could be elevated to soldiers or administrators, perpetuating the slave system, while daughters were often groomed for the same fate in other harems. The religious framework twisted this into divine right. Islamic law allowed unlimited concubines alongside 4 wives, with the Quran's verse on what your right hands possess, interpreted to justify owning and bedding slave women without consent. Scholars like Ibn Sina wrote treatises on optimizing concubine fertility, recommending positions and timings based on astrological charts. But the human cost was devastating. Many women suffered repeated miscarriages from the stress and poor conditions, their bodies worn out by constant pregnancies, some as young as 12, bearing child after child until they collapsed. Picture a scene from the Alhambra in Granada under the Nasrid dynasty, a successor to earlier caliphates. A Circassian girl, kidnapped from the Caucasus, arrives pale and terrified. She's renamed something generic like Pearl or Rose, her original identity erased. Eunuchs train her in the harem's hierarchy, where senior concubines, often former favourites, enforce brutal discipline on newcomers, jealous of any threat to their position. When the Sultan calls, she's perfumed, oiled, and presented like a gift. If she conceives, great. She might gain favour and manumission after birth. If not, she's deemed barren and demoted to menial labour or resold. Historical accounts from travellers like Ibn Battuta describe harems as prisons of silk, where women plotted murders and suicides to escape. One concubine in the Abbasid court poisoned herself after years of forced breeding, her story preserved in chronicles as a warning. The scale was immense. The Ottoman Topkapi Palace harem held up to 200 women at its peak, with breeding programs designed to produce loyal Janissary troops from slave unions. But wait, it gets even darker. Some caliphs practiced selective breeding, pairing light-skinned Slavic women with strong African men to create ideal mixed-race slaves, eugenics centuries before the term existed. Abortions were forbidden, but unwanted pregnancies from lower slaves were terminated brutally, with herbal poisons or physical trauma, leaving women maimed. The psychological warfare was relentless. Women were pitted against each other in beauty contests and fertility races, with favourites receiving luxuries while others starved. Incestuous elements crept in. Some rulers bedded their own slave daughters, rationalised as property rights. Escape attempts were met with horrific punishments, branding on the face, amputation of limbs, or being thrown to wild animals in palace menageries. Yet some rose to power, like Shajar al-Dur, a former concubine who became Sultana of Egypt in the 13th century. But her story is the exception, built on surviving unimaginable abuse. Here's what most people don't realise. This system wasn't just about pleasure, it was economic warfare. Concubines' children bolstered armies and bureaucracies without diluting noble bloodlines. In the Fatimid Caliphate, harem-born slaves formed elite guard units, their loyalty bought with the promise of freedom. But for the women, it was a lifetime of objectification. Medical texts from the era detail treatments for harem fatigue, including forced sterilizations for overused concubines via caustic insertions that scarred their insides, venereal diseases spread unchecked, with infected women isolated like diseased cattle until they died or recovered enough to breed again. The global reach amplified the terror. Raids into Europe brought Viking-captured Irish and English women to Andalusian harems, while African caravans supplied Nilotic beauties to Mecca's elites. In Zanzibar under Arab rule, Swahili women were prepared with genital modifications to increase desirability, echoing the infibulation horrors. Religious hypocrisy ran deep. While manumitting slaves was encouraged as charity, caliphs hoarded thousands, using fatwas to justify their harems as civilizing the infidels. One 10th century Baghdad scholar al-Jahiz wrote satirically about the absurdities, but his words fell on deaf ears amid the prophets. The legacy lingers in DNA studies showing Middle Eastern admixture in sub-Saharan populations, silent evidence of forced unions. Imagine the despair of a mother watching her child, born of rape, taken away to be raised as a slave soldier, never knowing her embrace again. This makes modern women's rights movements feel like a beacon of hope. Today we have laws against human trafficking, consent as a cornerstone of relationships, and reproductive rights that empower rather than enslave. No more cycle tracking by eunuchs, no more breeding contests. We've buried this chapter, but it shaped empires. But here's the truly stomach-churning part. At least harem women had roofs over their heads. What if the journey to slavery involved marches where half the captives died before arrival, their bones bleaching in the desert sun? What if the journey to slavery involved marches where half the captives died before arrival, their bones bleaching in the desert sun? Enter the third level of Caliphate slave horror, the Trans-Saharan death marches, where Arab traders herded millions of Africans across one of the world's harshest deserts in chains, treating them not as humans but as perishable cargo in a trade that spanned centuries and left landscapes littered with skeletons. This wasn't some minor footnote in history, it was the backbone of the Islamic slave economy from the 7th century onward, fueling the caliphates with labour, soldiers, and concubines. While the Atlantic slave trade gets all the attention in Western textbooks, the Arab trade across the Sahara enslaved an estimated 9 to 14 million people over around 200 years, with mortality rates during the journey hitting 50 to 80%, far deadlier than the Middle Passage. Captives, mostly from sub-Saharan kingdoms like Ghana, Mali, and Kanem, were rounded up in brutal raids by Tuareg and Berber middlemen working for Muslim merchants. They'd be yoked together with wooden collars or iron chains around their necks, wrists, and ankles, forming human trains that snaked through the blistering sands for up to 2,000 miles from places like Timbuktu to markets in Tripoli or Cairo. The ordeal began with the capture itself, villages burned, families slaughtered, survivors stripped of everything but their skin. Then came the march, often starting in the rainy season to avoid total dehydration, but that brought its own hells. Mud that sucked at chained feet, swarms of malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and flash floods that drowned entire caravans. Traders packed them tight, 100 to 500 per group, with minimal provisions, a handful of millet or dates per day, water rationed to a few sips from goatskin bags. If you fell behind from exhaustion, a whip cracked across your back, or worse, you were left to die, your body cut loose as a warning. Eyewitness accounts from Arab geographers like Al-Idrisi in the 12th century describe the routes as roads of death, with vultures circling overhead and jackals picking at the fallen. One common tactic was the forced pace, traders on camels whipping the line to maintain speed, knowing that slowing down meant more deaths from exposure. Temperatures soared to 20 degrees Fahrenheit by day, plummeting to freezing at night, causing heat stroke, hypothermia, and cracked skin that festered into infections. Women, often pregnant from rapes during capture, miscarried on the trail, their blood mixing with the sand. Children, too weak to keep up, were sometimes killed outright to save resources. But here's the gut-wrenching detail that history glosses over: the deliberate culling. Traders calculated acceptable losses, like modern actuaries, figuring that for every slave who reached the market, 2 or 3 would perish, cheaper to lose some than feed them all. Water stops were death traps. At oases, guards would hoard the wells, forcing slaves to beg or fight for a drink, leading to stampedes where the weak were trampled. Dehydration turned tongues black, eyes sunken, and skin like leather. Survivors recounted hallucinations of mirages that drove men mad, running off into the dunes to die alone. Salt tablets were sometimes given, but overdoses caused vomiting and further weakness. The physical toll was compounded by psychological warfare. Traders spread rumours of cannibals ahead or promised freedom at the end, only to laugh as hope crumbled. In the Balad al-Stan regions, where marches crossed endless ergs of shifting sand, entire caravans vanished in sandstorms, buried alive under dunes that preserved their mummified remains for archaeologists to find centuries later. One Infamous route, the Darb al-Arba'in, or 40 days road from Darfur to Egypt, earned its name from the average duration. But for many, it was an eternity of suffering, with skeletons marking the path like grim milestones. The economic machinery behind this was cold and calculated. Under the Umayyad and Abbasid Caliphates, slaves were a key commodity, traded alongside gold, ivory, and salt. Merchants like those in the Karimi Guild in Cairo financed expeditions, insuring against losses with shared risk pools, essentially medieval insurance for human cargo. caliphs imposed taxes on the trade, with zakat, charity tax, ironically funding mosques built from slave profits. Religious justifications twisted Islam's anti-slavery leanings. While the Prophet Muhammad owned slaves but encouraged kind treatment, jurists like those in the Maliki school allowed the capture of non-Muslims in jihad, framing the marches as civilizing journeys. But in reality, conversions en route were forced at sword point, with refusals meaning execution or abandonment. Women faced additional torments, raped repeatedly by guards to break them, their resulting pregnancies seen as bonuses, producing more slaves without extra cost. Children separated from mothers were carried in baskets on camels if lucky, or dragged if not, their small bodies giving out first. Survivor testimonies, rare as they are, paint vivid pictures. A 19th century account from explorer Heinrich Barth describes finding a caravan's remnants. Hundreds of bleached bones, chains still linking them, a silent scream across the desert. Archaeological evidence confirms the scale. Digs along the old routes in Niger and Libya uncover mass graves with shackle marks on bones, signs of malnutrition, and trauma fractures from beatings. Estimates suggest 5,000 to 10,000 died annually at the trade's peak in the 9th–11th centuries, their remains forming what one historian called the White Road of Bones. The survivors arrived broken, sold immediately to recoup costs, their spirits crushed to ensure docility. This system persisted into the 19th century under Ottoman successors, only ending with European colonial pressures. Imagine the irony. Empires praised for algebra and astronomy funded their golden ages on these death marches. Modern parallels pale. Today's migrant crises, horrific as they are, have aid organisations and international oversight. No more chained lines across deserts, no more calculated cullings. We've got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights banning slavery outright. But here's the bone-chilling truth. At least the march survivors reached markets alive. What awaited them there was a spectacle of degradation where humans were poked, prodded, and auctioned like animals, their dignity stripped in rituals designed to break the soul before the body. What awaited them there was a spectacle of degradation where humans were poked, prodded, and auctioned like animals, their dignity stripped in rituals designed to break the soul before the body. This brings us to the fourth level of caliphate slave horror. The ritual humiliations in the bustling slave markets of cities like Baghdad, Cairo and Zanzibar, where survivors of those death marches were transformed from people into commodities through public displays of shame that would make modern auction houses look like polite galleries. These weren't quick transactions. They were theatrical events, drawing crowds of merchants, nobles, and curious onlookers who treated the proceedings like entertainment, complete with haggling, inspections, and ritualized degradations that ensured no slave left with their humanity intact. From the 8th century under the Abbasids to the 19th under Ottoman rule, these markets, known as Souk al-Nakhasin or copper markets for the chains used, operated like stock exchanges for human flesh, with up to 20,000 slaves processed annually in peak hubs like Mecca during pilgrimage seasons. Arriving captives, already emaciated and scarred from the journey, were herded into holding pens like cattle, washed roughly with brackish water to make them presentable, and then paraded onto raised platforms for the main event. The ritual began with the stripping, public, methodical, and utterly dehumanizing. Men, women, and children were forced to disrobe in front of jeering crowds, their bodies oiled to shin under the sun, highlighting muscles for labourers or curves for concubines. Inspectors, often grizzled traders with years of experience, would circle them like vultures, prying open mouths to check teeth for age and health, pinching skin to test firmness, and even inserting fingers into private areas to verify virginity or detect diseases. One 10th century account from the geographer al-Muqaddasi describes a market in Basra where a young Nubian woman was made to jump and dance naked to demonstrate her vitality, while buyers shouted bids and crude jokes about her potential in bed. If a slave resisted, whips cracked, thin leather thongs that left welts without damaging the merchandise too much. Children fared no better. Boys as young as 5 were lifted like puppies, their genitals examined for future castration potential, while girls were graded on beauty scales that determined their fate as domestic servants or harem fodder. The air filled with the stench of fierce sweat, unwashed bodies, and incense burned to mask it all. as auctioneers chanted praises like, "Behold this sturdy Zanj, fresh from the sands, strong enough to mine salt for a lifetime." But here's the soul-crushing twist that textbooks omit. These humiliations were scripted rituals, designed not just for commerce but for psychological domination. Slaves were forced to perform tests to prove worth, men lifting heavy stones to show strength, women singing or reciting poetry to display refinement, all while naked and chained. In Cairo's markets under the Mamluks, a common practice was the tasting. Buyers could request a slave be fed specific foods to check digestion, or worse, sample their sweat for purity. Religious elements wove in hypocrisy. Imams sometimes blessed the sales, invoking verses about righteous ownership while forbidding the sale of Muslim slaves. Yet conversions were rushed on the spot if it meant higher prices. Non-Muslims were marked with temporary tattoos or brands denoting origin, like Sudani for Africans or Skaliba for Slavs, turning their skin into price tags. Haggling turned violent. If bids were low, auctioneers might demonstrate durability by beating a slave lightly, showing how much punishment they could take without breaking. Women endured the worst, prodded for breast firmness, made to walk in circles to display hips for childbearing, their screams drowned out by laughter. One horrifying custom in Zanzibar markets, inherited from Omani Arab traditions, involved virgin auctions, where girls were auctioned with guarantees, verified by midwives in front of the crowd, leading to bidding wars that could last hours. The social spectacle amplified the terror. Markets were community events. Families brought children to watch, teaching them the natural order of things. Street vendors sold snacks and trinkets nearby, turning human misery into a fairground. Elite buyers arrived in litters, sending servants to inspect while they sipped sherbet from afar. For the slaves, the mental breakdown was calculated. Being gawked at, touched by strangers, reduced to body parts eroded any sense of self. Many attempted suicide during these displays, biting their tongues or throwing themselves from platforms, only to be restrained and sold at discount as troublesome. Historical records from Ibn Jubayr's 12th century travels detail a market in Mecca where a group of Ethiopian slaves, after hours of probing, were forced to kneel and kiss the feet of buyers, symbolizing total submission. Prices varied wildly. A skilled artisan slave might fetch 500 dinars, while a defective one went for scraps, destined for worse fates. The economic engine was ruthless. Taxes on sales funded caliphal treasuries, with brokers taking cuts and even offering returns if a slave died within days, treating them like faulty goods. Archaeological finds in old market sites like those in Fustat, Old Cairo, reveal holding cells with chain anchors and bone fragments showing stress fractures from restraints. Survivor narratives, though scarce, echo the trauma. A freed slave in the 18th century Ottoman era wrote of the market of shame, where a man's worth was measured by his scars. This ritual wasn't isolated. It fed into broader caliphate society, where slaves' degraded status justified further abuses. Religious scholars debated finer points, like whether inspecting genitals violated modesty laws, but practice trumped piety. The legacy persists in cultural memories across Africa and the Middle East, with terms like abid, slave, still carrying derogatory weight. Imagine if today's online marketplaces treated people this way. International outrage would shut them down. We have human rights courts, anti-discrimination laws, and dignity as a universal principle. No more public strippings, no more durability tests. We've progressed, but the scars remain. But here's the flesh-melting reality. At least market slaves had a chance at survival through sale. What if your assigned labour involved descending into mines, where the very air dissolved your body, turning work into a slow, agonising death sentence? What if your assigned labour involved descending into mines where the very air dissolved your body, turning work into a slow, agonising death sentence? This plunges us into the fifth level of caliphate slave horror, the deadly labour in the salt mines of the Sahara and beyond, where African slaves were condemned to extract the white gold that flavoured caliphal banquets and preserved their army's food, but at the cost of their flesh literally melting away in corrosive hellscapes that claimed lives faster than any battlefield. These weren't ordinary mines, they were vast underground labyrinths like those at Taghaza and Tau Deni in the Mali region, operated under Abbasid, Fatimid, and later Ottoman oversight from the 8th century onward, where the trans-Saharan trade survivors, those who endured the marches and markets, were funneled into a fate worse than death. Salt was essential to the Caliphate's economy, used for everything from curing meat to trading for gold, and slaves provided the disposable workforce. Chained gangs of mostly Zanj, East African, and Sudanese men were marched to these remote outposts, often hundreds of miles from civilization, and forced underground into tunnels barely wide enough for a body, hacking at crystalline walls with crude picks under the dim flicker of oil lamps. The environment was a killer from the start. Surface temperatures in the Sahara could hit 130 degrees, but below ground it was a humid furnace laced with salt dust that invaded every pore, eye and lung. Slaves worked 12 to 18-hour shifts naked or in rags to combat the heat, their sweat mixing with airborne salt to form a caustic brine that ate away its skin like acid. Blisters formed within hours, bursting into open sores that never healed in the saline air. Infections set in, turning limbs gangrenous. One 14th century traveller, Ibn Battuta, visited Takaza and described it as a village of salt, where slaves' bodies were dissolved by the very element they mined, their skin sloughing off in sheets after months of exposure. The air was thick with crystalline particles that scarred lungs, causing silicosis-like conditions where men coughed up blood mixed with salt crystals, their breaths rasping like sandpaper. Dehydration was constant. Water was rationed to a few brackish sips per day, often contaminated with salt, leading to kidney failure and madness. If you collapsed from exhaustion, overseers, often freed slaves themselves, hardened by the survival, would drag you out and leave you to bake in the sun, your body desiccating into a mummified husk amid piles of discarded salt slabs. But here's the body-eroding detail that makes this atrocity stand out. The mines were engineered for maximum output, with zero regard for life. Tunnels extended miles deep, prone to collapses that buried dozens alive in avalanches of salt boulders. Survivors recounted the screams echoing through the dark as comrades were crushed, their bodies left entombed to avoid halting production. Flooding was another terror. Seasonal rain seeped in, dissolving walls into slurry that drowned workers or trapped them in the quicksand-like pits of liquefied salt. To extract the purest blocks, slaves waded into brine pools up to their waists, the hypersaline water burning like fire on open wounds, corroding flesh to the bone over time. Amputations were common. Fingers and toes rotted off from constant immersion, and without medical care, sepsis claimed most. Children, as young as 8, were sent into narrow veins adults couldn't fit, their small frames expendable, many suffocated in poorly ventilated shafts where toxic gases built up, their bodies hauled out like refuse. The quota system was merciless. Each slave had to produce several hundred pounds of salt daily, carried on their backs in heavy loads that broke spines and caused hernias. Failure meant floggings with salt-encrusted whips that reopened wounds, or being chained exposed to the elements overnight, where scorpions and sand vipers added to the agony. The scale of suffering powered an empire-wide industry. Under the Songhai Empire's Muslim rulers who traded with the Caliphates, mines like Taudeni produced thousands of tons annually, transported by camel caravans back to markets in Timbuktu or Fez. Caliphs in Baghdad and Cairo levied taxes on this salt, using it to preserve food for their vast armies during conquests. Ironic, since the slaves mining it starved on meagre rations of millet porridge, their bodies cannibalizing muscle for energy. Religious oversight added a layer of hypocrisy. Imams at the sites preached submission as a path to paradise, while ignoring verses on merciful treatment. Some slaves converted hoping for better conditions, but it rarely helped. They were still worked to death, their faith a tool for control. Escapes were futile. The surrounding desert was a natural prison, with runaways dying of thirst or recaptured and punished by having salt rubbed into lashes, amplifying the pain tenfold. Archaeological surveys in modern Mali reveal mine shafts filled with skeletal remains, bones etched with salt erosion and tool marks from endless labour. One mass grave at Bilma in Niger holds hundreds, their postures suggesting death mid-toil, tools still clutched in bony hands. Survivor rates were abysmal. Most lasted 6 months to 2 years before succumbing, their bodies dumped in surface pits where wind and sand preserved them as grim warnings. Women, though fewer in mines, faced sexual exploitation by guards bearing children who joined the workforce young. This system persisted into the 19th century, With European explorers like René Caillié witnessing salt hells under Arab overseers, slaves' gaze blinded by the constant glare, skin like cracked leather. The economic value was immense. Salt traded at weights equal to gold in some regions, making slave lives cheaper than tools. Imagine the despair of a man watching his flesh dissolve day by day, knowing his labour-enriched distant palaces he'd never see. This makes modern labour rights, minimum wages, safety regulations, unions, feel like salvation. Today, mining has OSHA standards, protective gear, and bans on forced labour. No more salt eating through skin, no more quotas enforced by whips. We've condemned such exploitation, but it built civilizations. But here's the mind-warping truth. At least mine slaves died mining resources. What if children were stolen, brainwashed, and turned into killing machines, their innocence weaponized against their own people? What if children were stolen, brainwashed, and turned into killing machines, their innocence weaponized against their own people? We've arrived at the 6th level of Caliphate slave horror, the child soldier conversions, where kidnapped boys from Christian Europe, pagan Africa, and beyond were systematically stripped of their identities, indoctrinated in fanatical Islamic militancy, and forged into elite warriors like the Janissaries or Mamluks, who often turned their swords on their own kin in a twisted cycle of loyalty through trauma. This wasn't sporadic raiding, it was an institutionalized pipeline that spanned the Umayyad, Abbasid, Fatimid, and especially the Ottoman eras, successors to the Caliphates, enslaving and converting hundreds of thousands of boys over centuries to build unstoppable armies. The process began with the devshirme system, a blood tax where Ottoman agents, building on earlier Caliphate practices, scoured Balkan villages for Christian boys aged 8 to 18, selecting the strongest and brightest, ripping them from screaming families in annual levies that could claim up to 3,000 per year. These children, dazed and terrified, were marched in chains to training camps in Anatolia or Egypt where the real horror unfolded, a brutal regimen designed to erase their past and rebuild them as devout Muslim soldiers, loyal only to the sultan or caliph. Picture a boy from a Serbian village in the 15th century under Ottoman rule. He's torn from his mother's arms, his father's pleas ignored as raiders invoke the caliph's right to harvest infidel youth for jihad. Upon arrival at the Assemi Oglan barracks, he's stripped of his clothes, name, and faith, renamed something like Ahmed or Mustafa, forbidden to speak his native tongue under pain of whipping. The indoctrination was methodical, blending physical torture with psychological manipulation. Days started at dawn with forced prayers, memorizing Quran verses that justified holy war, while instructors, often former converts themselves, beat any sign of resistance with rods or falaka, bastinado on the feet that left permanent limps. Food was withheld until the boy recited Islamic creeds perfectly, creating a Pavlovian link between survival and submission. Older recruits mentored the new, enforcing the hierarchy through violence. Refusal to convert meant execution or sale to harsher labours, like the mines we discussed. But conversion was just the start. Military training turned play into warfare. Boys drilled with wooden swords from age 10, progressing to live blades, forced to spar until blood flowed, learning to kill without hesitation. Historical chronicles from the Mamluk era describe boys as young as 12 being made to execute prisoners, often from their own ethnic groups, to prove their new allegiance, severing ties to their heritage and pools of blood. But here's the mind-shattering lens that exposes the depth of this atrocity. The brainwashing incorporated deliberate trauma bonding. Instructors alternated cruelty with kindness, a beating followed by a meal, isolation in dark cells broken by group prayers that fostered false family ties. This created Stockholm-like loyalty, where boys viewed the caliph as a father figure, their unit as brothers. In the Janissary Corps, which peaked at 200,000 under Suleiman the Magnificent, recruits underwent trials of faith, like fasting for days while guarding harems, or charging mock enemies reciting war cries from the Quran. Some were castrated partially to curb distractions, echoing earlier eunuch horrors, ensuring focus on battle. The psychological scars ran deep. Many developed what we'd call PTSD, manifesting in fanatical zeal. Janissaries were known for berserker charges in battles like Constantinople's fall in 1453, where converted boys slaughtered their orthodox kin without mercy. Ottoman records boast of this system of uplift, claiming it civilized barbarians, but survivors' rare accounts, like those smuggled to Europe, reveal nightmares of lost identity, boys forgetting their mothers' faces, haunted by guilt for betraying their roots. The scale was staggering. From the 14th to 17th centuries, over 200,000 boys were devshirmade, with similar systems in earlier caliphates like the Abbasids' Ghilman troops, drawn from Central Asian and Slavic youths. The religious machinery oiled this engine of conversion. Fatwas from scholars like those in Al-Azhar justified taking child slaves as rescue from Kufa, unbelief, twisting hadiths on educating captives into mandates for militarization. Boys were taught that killing infidels, including former countrymen, earned paradise, with imams leading sessions on jihad that glorified martyrdom. In Egypt's Mamluk Sultanate, which ruled from the 13th century, purchased child slaves from Circassia, and Georgia were trained similarly, rising to power as rulers who perpetuated the cycle by raiding for more boys. Escape was rare, tattoos or brands marked them as property, and recapture meant horrific punishments like hamstringing to prevent flight. Women played peripheral roles. Some harems produced sons funneled into these programs, their maternal bonds severed early. Archaeological evidence from training sites in Turkey shows barracks with punishment cells, bones of youths with stress fractures from drills. The irony burns. These slave soldiers often became the caliphate's backbone, like the Mamluks who defeated Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260, their victories built on broken childhoods. Modern child soldier crises in places like Africa pale, without the state-sponsored indoctrination. Today, we have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, banning recruitment under 18, with rehabilitation programs for victims. Imagine a boy's confusion turning to rage, channeled into conquest that expanded the very empire that stole him. This weaponization of innocence fueled centuries of dominance, but at unimaginable human cost. We've outlawed such practices, with international tribunals prosecuting warlords for similar crimes. No more blood taxes, no more forced conversions at Rod's End, but here's the identity-shattering revelation. At least these boys were given weapons and purpose, however twisted. What if the ultimate goal was total erasure, stripping slaves of names, faiths, and histories until nothing remained of who they were? What if the ultimate goal was total erasure, stripping slaves of names, faiths, and histories until nothing remained of who they were? This catapults us to the 7th level of caliphate slave horror, the systematic erasure of identities, where captives across the Umayyad, Abbasid, and Ottoman empires were subjected to a calculated program of cultural genocide, forcibly converted to Islam, renamed with Arabic monikers, and brainwashed to forget their origins, turning diverse peoples into homogenized servants who often policed their own kind's subjugation. This wasn't mere assimilation. It was a soul-destroying machine that operated from the 7th century onward, affecting millions, ensuring that slaves not only served but internalized their inferiority, their paths dissolved like ink in water. The process started immediately after capture or purchase. Raiders or market overseers would gather new slaves in groups, often in mosque courtyards or palace halls, where mullahs performed mass conversions under duress. A splash of water, a recited shahada, declaration of faith, and suddenly a Christian from Byzantium or a pagan from the Sudan was Muslim, but refusal meant death by beheading or crucifixion, as per interpretations of Sharia that deemed apostasy or resistance punishable. Names were the first to go. A boy named Ivan became Ibrahim, a woman called Aisha, ironically, after the Prophet's wife, regardless of her wishes, erasing family lineages in a single decree. Ottoman records from the 16th century detail scribes logging these renamings in ledgers, categorizing slaves by new identities like convert from the Franks or black from Bilad al-Sudan, their original names forbidden under threat of tongue-lashing or mutilation. Picture a group of freshly arrived Slavic slaves in 9th century Baghdad under Caliph al-Ma'mun. They're herded into a dimly lit chamber, still chained from the journey, their clothes in tatters. A cleric intones prayers while assistants shave their heads, symbolizing rebirth into Islam, and circumcise the males without anesthesia, the pain a purification ritual that left infections raging. Women had their traditional jewellery confiscated, their hair cut short or veiled forcibly, stripping symbols of their heritage. Then came the indoctrination sessions, daily classes where slaves memorized Arabic phrases, Quran surahs emphasizing obedience to masters as a religious duty. With beatings for mispronunciations, instructors used divide and conquer tactics, rewarding quick learners with better food, while punishing slow ones with isolation, fostering betrayal among the group. Historical accounts from Al-Tabari's chronicles describe slaves being forced to denounce their old gods publicly, smashing idols or burning crosses in ceremonies that drew crowds, turning personal faith into spectacle. For children, it was even more insidious. Separated from parents, they were raised in state orphanages like the Ottoman Enderun schools, where Turkish became their only language, Islamic history their only narrative, erasing any memory of home through repetition and reward. One devastating practice was memory tests. Slaves recounting their past lives were whipped until they forgot, conditioning them to suppress origins. But here's the identity-dissolving truth that pierces deepest. This erasure was engineered for control, creating a class of slaves who identified with their oppressors. In the Mamluk system, converted slaves rose to elite status, but only after total disconnection. They were forbidden contact with unconverted kin, their letters intercepted, ensuring loyalty to the caliph alone. Religious scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah in the 14th century issued fatwas mandating such conversions as merciful, claiming it saved souls from hellfire while ignoring the trauma. Women in harems underwent cultural purification, learning Arabic poetry and customs while being punished for speaking native tongues, their children raised as Muslims without knowledge of maternal heritage. The psychological impact was profound. Many developed dissociative disorders, what we'd call identity fragmentation, leading to suicides or catatonic states. In extreme cases, slaves were tattooed with ownership marks incorporating Islamic symbols, branding faith onto skin as permanent as scars. Ottoman Devshirme boys, as we touched on earlier, exemplified this. Converted young, they became janissaries who suppressed revolts in their homelands, their erased identities weaponized against former communities. Archaeological evidence from slave quarters in Istanbul reveals hidden artifacts like concealed crosses or pagan amulets, desperate attempts to cling to the past, often discovered and destroyed. The scale amplified the devastation. Estimates suggest 70 to 80% of slaves in the caliphates were forcibly converted, with mass ceremonies during conquest like the Abbasid expansion into India or Africa, where entire villages were Islamized en masse. Resistance sparked horrors. In 10th century Andalusia under the Umayyads, Mozarabic Christians who clung to their faith were crucified upside down, their conversions extracted through torture. Economic incentives greased the wheels. Converted slaves fetched higher prices as trustworthy, and manumission was dangled as a reward for fervent piety, though few achieved it. The hypocrisy shone through. While Islam prohibits forcing conversion, jurists twisted no compulsion in religion to allow it for captives, framing it as enlightenment. Survivor tales, like those in the Epic of Sundiata from Mali, hint at oral histories preserved secretly, but most were lost forever. This erasure extended to languages and customs. Slaves caught practicing old rituals faced amputation or stoning, their cultures diluted into oblivion. Imagine a man whispering his true name in the dark only to forget it over years of conditioning, his sense of self replaced by servitude. Modern identity rights, freedom of religion, cultural preservation, even name changes by choice, stand in stark contrast. Today we have UNESCO protecting heritage, laws against forced conversion, and therapy for trauma survivors. No more mass renamings, no more shaved heads as rebirth. We've recognized identity as sacred, but empires built on its destruction. The legacy echoes in diaspora communities, where descendants grapple with lost ancestries. This total unmaking turned humans into blank slates, programmable for empire. But here's the culture-crushing revelation. At least erased identities left slaves alive in body. What if punishment for rebellion involved flayings and impalements that made death a mercy? Public spectacles designed to terrorize entire populations into submission? What if punishment for rebellion involved flayings and impalements that made death a mercy? Public spectacles designed to terrorize entire populations into submission? We're descending into the 8th level of Caliphate's slave horror. The barbaric public executions and tortures inflicted on rebellious slaves, where uprisings or even minor insubordinations triggered displays of cruelty so extreme that they served as living warnings, etched into the collective memory of empires from the Umayyads to the Ottomans, ensuring obedience through sheer terror. This wasn't random violence, it was state-sanctioned theatre, performed in city squares and along trade routes, where slaves' bodies became canvases for caliphal power, their agonies prolonged to maximise fear. The Zanj rebellion of 869–83 in southern Iraq under the Abbasids exemplifies this. Thousands of East African slaves, risen against brutal labour in the marshes, were crushed with methods that turned suppression into spectacle. Captured rebels weren't just killed, they were paraded through Basra, stripped and chained, before being subjected to qisaas, like retributions amplified for horror. One common fate was flaying alive, skin peeled from flesh with hooked knives, starting at the feet and working up. The victim kept conscious with stimulants like vinegar-soaked cloths, their screams amplified by the crowd's silence. Chronicler Al-Tabari describes a Zanj leader flayed in Baghdad's main square. His skin hung like a banner from the city gates, a dripping reminder for weeks. Picture the scene in 9th century Basra. A group of recaptured Zanj slaves, their bodies already scarred from whips and labour, are dragged to the execution ground amid drumming and chants from muezzins, invoking divine justice. The caliph's executioners, clad in black, begin with minor tortures, branding with hot irons shaped like Quranic verses, searing flesh to purify the rebellious soul. Then comes impalement, a sharpened stake, often smeared with the oil for smoother entry, driven through the rectum or vagina, emerging from the mouth or shoulder, the victim hoisted upright to writhe for hours or days. To prolong suffering, stakes were blunted or angled to avoid vital organs, allowing the condemned to slide slowly, gravity tearing internals. Women rebels faced gendered horrors, genital mutilation before impalement, their wombs targeted as symbols of ungrateful fertility. Crowds were mandatory, families of loyal slaves were forced to watch, children included, to instill generational fear. In the Ottoman era, during suppressions like the 1821 Greek revolts involving enslaved populations, impalements lined roadsides, bodies left to rot as vultures picked at them, the stench a constant reminder. One account from traveller Evliya Çelebi details a rebel slave in Anatolia impaled alive for 3 days, begging for death while guards fed him just enough to extend the agony. But here's the terror-amplifying truth that chills to the core. These punishments were ritualized for psychological impact. Blending Islamic legal precedents with sadistic innovation, Sharia allowed hudud penalties like crucifixion for highway robbery or rebellion, but caliphs expanded them. Crucifixions involved nailing slaves to crosses smeared with honey to attract insects, their bodies eaten alive by ants and flies over days. In the Fatimid Caliphate, during quelling of Berber uprisings in North Africa, rebels were sawn in half vertically, starting from the groin, saws dulled to drag out the process, blood pooling as crowds chanted takbirs. Poisonings were subtler horrors, slaves forced to drink slow-acting toxins like arsenic-laced wine, convulsing publicly for hours while clerics preached on disobedience. Group punishments escalated the dread. During the 976 slave revolt in Egypt, entire families of rebels were buried alive in pits. Sand poured over them as they clawed for air, a method echoed in Ottoman suppressions where pits became mass graves for the living. Executioners competed in creativity. One Mamluk technique involved blood eagles, carving wings into backs before pulling lungs through, a nod to Viking influences via traded slaves. Religious justification twisted mercy into monstrosity. Fatwas claimed such tortures encouraged repentance, with imams offering last-minute conversions, only to proceed anyway if defiance lingered. The spectacle served propaganda purposes, with town criers announcing executions days in advance, drawing spectators from afar. In Mecca under Abbasid rule, pilgrim seasons doubled as punishment festivals, slaves executed before holy sites to sanctify the act. The physical remnants were weaponized, heads mounted on spikes along walls, flayed skin stuffed with straw and paraded like scarecrows, hands and feet distributed as trophies to loyalists. Survivor rates? Near zero, but some were maimed instead, noses slit, ears cropped, tongues removed to live as walking examples, begging in streets with signs detailing their crimes. Archaeological digs in Iraq and Turkey uncover execution sites with bones bearing saw marks, nail holes, and chemical traces of poisons, silent witnesses to the scale. Estimates suggest tens of thousands met such ends annually at the empire's height, quelling revolts before they spread. The irony stings. Empires touting justice systems inflicted injustices that would shame modern dictators. Today we have the International Criminal Court prosecuting torture as war crimes, bans on cruel punishments, and human rights observers. No more public flayings. No more stakes through bodies. We've evolved to value due process and dignity in death. The terror didn't end with the act. It rippled, suppressing resistance for generations. Slaves whispered of these horrors, obedience bought with remembered screams. But here's the revolt-quashing revelation. At least punished slaves had the chance to rebel first. What if daily life involved routine violations that broke the spirit without ever raising a hand in defiance? A constant grind of dehumanization. What if daily life involved routine violations that broke the spirit without ever raising a hand in defiance? A constant grind of dehumanization. This grinds us into the 9th level of Caliphate slave horror. The everyday degradations and micro-tortures that permeated slaves' existence, where Umayyad, Abbasid, and Ottoman masters enforced a regimen of subtle cruelties, from forced nudity and dietary starvation to constant surveillance and familial separations, designed to erode will without overt violence, turning living beings into automata who question their own humanity. This wasn't the spectacle of executions or marches, it was the slow drip of oppression that made rebellion unthinkable, woven into the fabric of Caliphate society from the 7th century to the 19th, affecting every slave from domestic servants in Cordoba to field workers in Mesopotamia. In households across the empires, slaves woke before dawn to the call of overseers, their sleep curtailed to 6 hours on the straw mats infested with lice, bodies aching from yesterday's labours. Clothing was a privilege denied, many toiled naked, or in threadbare rags, not for practicality but to reinforce shame. Women in harems might wear silks during service, but stripped bare for chores, their exposure a reminder of ownership. Men in agricultural gangs wore only loincloths, their skin baked by sun or chafed by chains, with tattoos or brands proclaiming property of, followed by a master's name, visible badges of subjugation that invited public mockery. The dietary controls were a weapon of weakening. Slaves received meagre rations, stale bread, watery gruel, occasional scraps of meat if lucky, but portioned to keep them alive yet malnourished, sapping strength for escape or revolt. In the Fatimid Caliphate's Egyptian estates, overseers mixed sand into food to bulk it, causing internal abrasions and chronic pain, while withholding water during peak heat to induce delirium. Religious hypocrisy flavoured this. While Islam mandated feeding slaves what masters ate, in practice caliphs like Al-Hakim enforced purification diets of minimal sustenance, claiming it humbled the soul. Children suffered most, or orphaned slave kids in Ottoman Devshirme households were fed just enough to grow into useful tools, their growth stunted by deficiencies that left them with brittle bones and foggy minds. Surveillance amplified the isolation. Eunuch guards in palaces monitored every move, reporting whispers of discontent for punishment, creating paranoia where slaves distrusted even each other. Conversations were forbidden without permission, languages policed, a slip into a native tongue earned a slap or worse, forcing a veneer of compliance. Familial bonds were systematically shattered, husbands and wives sold separately at markets, children snatched from mothers at weaning to be raised as house slaves elsewhere, letters or reunions banned to prevent attachments that might spark uprising. One 12th century account from Ibn Jubir describes a Damascus household where a slave mother, upon birthing, had her infant immediately removed, her milk expressed for the master's children while she wept in silence, the routine so normalized it went unremarked. But here's the spirit-corroding detail that reveals the insidious genius. These degradations were embedded in daily rituals, making normalcy itself torturous. Morning ablutions involved communal washing under watchful eyes, bodies inspected for cleanliness with invasive prods, turning hygiene into humiliation. Workdays stretched 14 hours, from tilling fields in chains that rubbed ankles raw to scrubbing floors on knees until they bled, with no breaks except for forced prayers where slaves knelt behind free Muslims, reinforcing hierarchy. In urban settings like Baghdad under the Abbasids, domestic slaves endured errand runs through crowded streets, collared like dogs with bells that announced their status, inviting spits and stones from passers-by. Sexual violations were routine, not just in harems, but everywhere. Masters claimed right of use on female slaves, often in shared quarters where others heard the assaults, normalizing rape as a perk of ownership. Men weren't spared. Some were forced into humiliating roles, like bathing guests or performing demeaning tasks naked, their manhood mocked. Psychological games abounded. Masters promised manumission for good behaviour, only to renege, dangling hope like a carrot before yanking it away, breeding despair. In Ottoman galleys, there were rowers chained to oars endured constant motion sickness, their excrement pooling at feet with floggings for slowing rhythm, a daily hell that broke minds before bodies. Medical neglect compounded it. Illnesses went untreated unless affecting productivity, with slaves experimenting on each other with folk remedies, their suffering dismissed as fate. The scale turned households into mini prisons. Estimates suggest 80% of Caliphate slaves endured such routines, their lives a monotonous blur of erosion. Religious texts provided cover. Jurists like al-Shafi'i argued slaves' inferior status justified lesser treatment, twisting charity into control. In rural plantations of the Mesopotamian Sawad, slaves toiled in irrigation ditches, feet rotting in fetid water, their only rest being chained sleep under stars, vermin their companions. Children learned early, tasked with fetching for elders, beaten for spills, their innocence curdled into resignation. Archaeological finds from slave quarters in Medina show cramped cells with restraint hooks, pottery shards etched with desperate prayers in forbidden scripts. Survivor narratives, like those in the 18th century memoir of a freed Moroccan slave, detail the silent breaking where one forgot joy, laughter becoming a foreign concept. This daily grind suppressed revolts more effectively than armies. Slaves too exhausted to dream of freedom. Imagine waking each day to erasure, your body a tool, your thoughts policed. A life where dignity was a myth. Modern labour laws, weekends, privacy rights feel revolutionary in comparison. Today, we have protections against exploitation, therapy for trauma, families intact. No more bell collars, no more sand in bread. We've humanised work, but empires thrived on its opposite. Cumulative effect? A population of shadow suits, alive but hollowed. But here's the legacy-haunting revelation. At least these daily horrors affected individuals. What if the final atrocity was the intergenerational trauma and economic systems that perpetuated slavery's scars across centuries, shaping societies long after the caliphates fell?